sometimes during the mid to the early to the mid 70s, I came into, he came on my radar. The reason that he came on my radar because he was a history professor at Jackson State University. And if you, to understand the 1970s, the early to 1970s, people, historically black schools and schools colleges and universities had just began to offer courses in African history, courses in black history. And he got my attention because he was teaching some of those courses at Jackson State University.
I met him actually when he was working on his doctorate. I was a freshman at the University of Washington in Seattle. And I just happened to come across him on campus, and we started talking. And he told me he was from Mississippi, and of course I was elated because there was so few of us African-American students on the campus there. I didn't associate with him that much, again, because I was a freshman and he was working on his doctorate, so we just kind of run into each other every now and then.
It seemed like I've known Dr. Phillips most of my life. He and my father were really good friends. They did a lot of socio-political work throughout the late 60s, early 70s, and so they knew each other either through political grassroots organizing. And then I met him on my own once I became a student at Jackson State. He was my professor for my social institutions class, but even though he was just my professor for that one class, I found myself going to his office a lot because, outside of my family, probably Dr. Phillips and a few of my literary mentors, Dr. Phillips is one of the people who has most influenced what I conceive of intellectualism, scholarship, and more specifically, that true scholarship is designed to aid the community, right? If you're not so that's how I met Dr. Phillips is first through my father and the work they were doing in the community, and then as my professor.
I met Dr. Phillips back in 1993, and it was at one of our union meetings here in Jackson at the Sun and Sand Hotel.
I met Dr. Phillips probably about 14 or 15 years ago. It was in 2004-5, and met him through my work with the labor movement. He, when we were having various meetings, with the community, Dr. Phillips was always in the room, willing to listen to some of the concerns that were happening around organizing efforts the UAW was doing at the time, at the up in Canton at the Nissan plant.
I met Dr. Phillips when I was a freshman in college. He was an upperclassman, perhaps a sophomore. And what stood out about him was that he was the caregiver for a blind student. We didn't have special services or disability services at Jackson State at the time. So Dr. Phillips was the caregiver for a blind student named Roger Hammond. And Dr. Phillips would take him they were roommates in the same dorm that I was in, of course, and Dr. Phillips took him to the cafeteria for his meals and went to classes with him. And that's when over the years, I said that Dr. Phillips got a double education because they weren't majoring in the same thing. So he took Roger to class, and then he went to his own classes. So he stayed there with Roger. He went to school twice, every day.
I was born in Rosedale, Mississippi, which is in Bolivar County. I was born the summer of 1942, same as Aretha Franklin, Curtis Mayfield. My mother, Annie Phillips, and my father's Charles Thomas. He was from Vicksburg, she was from Arkansas. I have 3 siblings, 1 brother, 2 sisters. And of course I should say had, because my oldest sister is now deceased. And of that 4, I am the youngest. And I guess I should add, I also had a sister who died in infancy. Oh, my fondest memories of growing up have to do with, number 1, playing baseball. I loved baseball and would do almost anything to get a chance to play. And I generally played first base or I was a pitcher. Secondly, I had a lot of fond memories as, believe it or not, an actor in high school. I was in several plays, and my junior year, I think, my English teacher suggested that maybe I ought to go and try to become an actor. But I had a fairly fun-filled time growing up, even though on the other side of it, it was real hard, because I spent my summers pretty much picking and chopping cotton. We actually had what was called a split school session. We chopped cotton, which means weeding it, getting the weeds out and all that kind of stuff. We usually chopped cotton from early May to early July. Then we spent 2 months in school, and then we got out in early September in order to pick cotton. We lived in Rosedale, roughly a block and a half from the courthouse, so we rode trucks to the field to pick and chop cotton. And the chopping cotton, we were generally paid $2.50 or $3 a day. And for picking cotton, we were generally paid $2.50 for 100 pounds or $3 for 100 pounds. And so I picked cotton roughly from, I would say, about the 4th grade through high school, except for 2 years when I worked in the grocery store. I stocked the shelves, I bagged grocery, I took grocery to customers' cars. I put the quarter of beef on the thing for the butcher to cut it up. I was the one who drew the kerosene when the customer needed kerosene. I did the cleaning up, sweeping and mopping, that kind of thing. I worked long hours. I generally worked after school, roughly from 4 o'clock until they closed at 10 at night. And on weekends, I worked from 8 o'clock Saturday morning until 11 o'clock Saturday night. And then I worked Sunday mornings from 8 o'clock until they closed at noon. How did I do homework? I had to do my homework, I guess, those first 30 minutes after I got out of school, or after I got home at 10 that night. Now, fortunately, we did have 1 study period during the day, so I could do some of it during my study period. I may have been most studious in my early elementary years. I was fortunate that my babysitters, one was blind and the other was almost disabled, and so they were always at home with me, and they taught me a lot of the stuff that kids were supposed to learn in preschool, and they got me into the habit of loving to read and that kind of thing. And so I did that quite studiously in elementary school. So much so that by the time I got to middle school, it wasn't as much of a challenge. But then when I got in high school, for the first time, hold on to your chair, for the first time, we had teachers who actually had college degrees. Prior to that, our teachers generally taught during the regular 9 months, and they went to Mississippi Valley State University in the off season. And fortunately, I've helped a lot of them with their homework when I was in middle school. But high school, it was a different thing. Those teachers already had degrees, and they challenged us quite a bit. 2 teachers in particular, my English teacher, Miss Lily Mae Daly Smith, was exceptionally good. And then my social studies teacher, Miss Mabel Johnson Moore, was very good. And they really kept us on our toes. And our high school was so challenging until we generally barely passed. And and when I say barely passed, I mean made a C. I graduated as valedictorian, but I barely had a B average because they were extremely challenging. But that academic challenging kind of prepared me for Jackson State. Now, having said that, we took a standardized test at Coleman High in Greenville, and this was the test, to see if you were ready for college. As a result of that test, I ended up earning a scholarship to Jackson State, but the summer prior to my freshman year, we spent 8 weeks in what was called the college readiness program. So even though I scored well, they still wanted to make sure I could write decent sentencing and that kind of thing. And that catapulted me even more into academics so far as Jackson State was concerned. There were, I think, about 23 of us in that college readiness program, and they generally were valedictorians and salutatorians from around the state. So it was really challenging because I had to try to make sure I kept up with those other kids. And many of them had come from much better equipped schools than I had come from. I was really sort of afraid of going. My first choice, I was going to go to Kahoma Junior College, which is in Clarksdale, 40 miles north. And they had a bus that ran, to and from there every day. So I was going to stay at home and go to Kahoma. Unfortunately, Kahoma never answered my correspondence when I tried to get registered. And so I ended up not going to Kahoma, but Jackson State instead. Now I'm glad that I did because I had the opportunity to live in the dormitory, and I think that made a great big difference in how I matured or learned self-reliance and all that kind of stuff. I met a lot of people because by living in a dormitory, I was now kind of outgoing. I deliberately met them, and I had a world atlas. And every time I would meet some, I'd go back to my world atlas and I would open it and circle the hometown where they were from. And so I learned a lot of towns in Mississippi and Louisiana that I'd never heard of or didn't know existed. I enrolled in the summer of 1960 and I graduated spring of 63. I was really very surprised when I got to Jackson State and found out there people were actually talking about civil rights and the civil rights movement and stuff in class, because none of that had occurred when I was in high school. And then there was the opportunity to actually participate because the Masonic Temple was only a block and a half away from Jackson State. And we frequently would meet with Medgar Evers right across the street in the MLS drugstore. So that was quite new and different. And right across the street from Jackson State at that time, there was Campbell College, which was a black African Methodist Episcopal college. And they were as active as Tougaloo. So we could also go right across the street and become fully involved in the movement at Campbell College. We could look at Central High School, which was all white, and see how much better endowed it was than Jim Hill or Lanier High School, and wonder, well, when are we going to be able to get the same kind of equipment? Most of the clothing stores downtown, black folks couldn't try on the clothing that they wanted to buy. And of course, the lunch counters were still segregated. And just those kinds of things made a real difference, or you could see the real contrast. Well, rather than scream, let me give you what I guess was kind of a funny story. Me and my two roommates decided to walk down to the state capitol one Saturday afternoon just to view the state capitol building. And we'd gone all over the state capitol and was, getting kind of tired and thirsty. So I stopped to get a drink of water. And when I looked up, they had both run out of the building and were way down the street. And when I finally caught up with him, I said, "Why you guys run off and leave me?" He said, "You know what you did? You drank out that white fountain." Yeah. I didn't even see the sign. I was just thirsty, and I was getting a drink of water at the state capitol. My major at Jackson State was social science education, which encompassed history, political science, sociology, economics, and geography. I think my most influential professors in that area was a man named V. Horatio Henry. He was from England, and he only taught me during that summer of the college readiness program, but he was so impressive and opened my eyes so much to what the social sciences were until that stuck with me throughout my tenure at Jackson State. A second very influential person, of course, is Margaret Walker Alexander and Dr. Richard Jefferson. They both taught humanities. Humanities at that time was a 5-hour course that combined world literature, music appreciation, art appreciation, philosophy, and history. And you studied it by time periods. And to me, that was really fascinating to see how they all fit together to inform human beings in those time periods. She was tremendously gifted. I mean tremendously. But the funny thing is, she was so brilliant, she also expected everybody else to at least strive to be brilliant in that kind of way. And so the standard was up real high. And I remember one day she sent me to the library to get a book. And I guess being a young teenager, I didn't really listen very carefully. She asked me to go and get a book called The Negro Caravan. I came back with a book called The Negro Vanguard. Man, she almost threw me out of the office, just low-rated me all to the highest. But I appreciated the kind of gift that she had. She was really brilliant. And as a part of humanities, one of the favorite lectures that we always enjoyed was when she talked about how Reconstruction was an aborted movement, where black folks were going and how it was so suddenly and tragically ended. And of course, that really just shook everybody up. And as she was doing it, she was very emotional. She'd be pounding on the desk and just expressing herself.
Now, one of the other things about Dr. Phillips was that there was a gentleman who had been active in the civil rights era in Jackson and around the state of Mississippi. The gentleman's name was Henry J. Kirksey, and Henry Kirksey served in Mississippi State Legislature at one time as a senator, but he was also a demographer. Now the press would refer to him as a map maker. Well, that's what a demographer is a map maker. And one of his chief partners in doing this work was Dr. Ivory Phillips. And so we all had in the community the utmost respect for Senator Kirksey. And we had that respect because the way that he looked at redistricting in the state of Mississippi was just phenomenal and way ahead of its time. And Dr. Phillips assisted him in that work. I know it had a good bit around the building the narrative of the work. Map making, a demographer, if you will, is kind of boring, but it has to have, because it's numbers, it's a hard science, and it has to have its numbers, but it also has to have an exciting and inviting narrative. And I think that Dr. Ivory Phillips was helpful, very helpful in providing the narrative for Senator Kirksey?
I think that one of the things that Dr. Phillips did in that movement was community education. He is real. He's an expert at taking data, right? Taking research jargon and making it plain. So whenever you would go to those meetings, and Kirksey was great at that too, and somebody else who was great at that was Hollis Watkins and also Mike Sayer. Those two who were working over Southern Echo along with Leroy Johnson. But Dr. Phillips was really keen, really expert about explaining to the people in various communities, West Jackson, South Jackson, right, that this data means that you guys have power that you don't even know that you have. So if you would go to a lot of those community meetings when they were strategizing and changing the districts and getting people involved, Dr. Phillips was always right there, always able to take this very specific and complex data and show the community that all this is saying is that you now have the agency to make decisions for your own livelihood.
One of the first pieces I remember Kirksey did, I was still at Jackson State at that time, he compiled a lot of statistics that dealt with appropriations of funds for the local school districts, and he compared the black districts to the white districts. We never left that piece, even though it was written back when I was in college. We periodically went back and looked at that as we talked about what has happened to black schools and black school districts since integration. We have looked at those statistics and compared them with statistics of how money is appropriated to Jackson State, Alcorn Valley compared to the others. In terms of appropriations, apportionment. In terms of apportionment, we've looked at how blacks are consistently not only undercounted, but often tried to chip away and put them in majority white districts so that their influence would be lessened. One of the real lessons that I learned from him, going back and looking at the Mississippi Delta as a region. At one point, the Mississippi Delta, and I think this was during the days John Lynch was in Congress, the Mississippi Delta was the area that he represented in Congress. Well, after they ousted him from Congress, over the years, what they did, they redrew the map of Mississippi so that the northern part of the Delta, up around Clarksdale, was in one district. The central area of it, which is Greenville and Rolling Fork, was in another district. And then the bottom part down by Port Gibson was in still another district. And what that did was made it impossible for blacks to vote as a block and elect a congressperson. So Senator Kirksey then went back and looked at the old district of Lynch and looked at that configuration that was divided in three and began working on a way to have it reconfigured as a single district. And of course, with his successful lawsuit, then we get Mike Esper being elected as the first black congressman since Reconstruction for that district.
And so, what is the legacy of that? What is the importance of that today? And how can we preserve that going into the future?
Well, the great thing about Kirksey was, number one, he did not fear entering lawsuits. And number two, he always tried to find lawyers who were courageous enough to see it through. So his legacy then is not only that single black congressional district where Benny Thompson now is the representative, but also the lawsuit to create the present mayor council form of government that we have in Jackson. Because at the time when Kirksey first started, Jackson was represented by 3 white commissioners. They first were all elected at large, and then it broke it up into 3 districts. But even with 3 districts, it was not enough for black folks, to gain a foothold. But by breaking it up into male council form of government, there were enough black folks in Jackson to have 3 out of the 7 city council seats. So that's also his legacy. Thirdly, it's a result of his efforts that I started to say more than double, but we went from 1 black in the state legislature to now almost 50 blacks in the state legislature. All this reapportionment, and had directly to do with Kirksey and his lawsuits. That's his legacy as well. It also happened that virtually every county, especially those in the Delta, now have some black representation. He was a real genius and a courageous man to initiate all of those lawsuits. And there were a lot of us who were proud to be foot soldiers with him as he did these kind of things.
Dr. Phillips was one of those, he's one of those rare people who can be both a administrative intellectual and a foot soldier, right? He doesn't see a division in those two things. A lot of people that, they can do the kind of intellectual administrative work, and then you have other people who can do really kind of grassroots movement, organizational work. And he's one of those very few people that I've seen do all of those things across the spectrum. And so he's really been influential for me, watching him work with Kirksey, especially around redistricting and other issues. So Dr. Phillips, when we discuss the movement that led to the explosion of elected black officials in Mississippi, and Mississippi leading the nation early in elected black officials, Dr. Phillips was one of those people who was right there in the thick of that movement.
Well, the impact that Dr. Phillips has made it's phenomenal. It's mountaintop. Now, here's why I say that. Even today, we're wrestling with the true history of the state of Mississippi, and it's really not out there where people really know. What happened during Reconstruction, what happened before Reconstruction, and what happened after the Reconstruction period, and what happened all the way up through the Civil Rights era, and what happened between the Civil Rights era and now. But so the information that he was able to transfer to people, help build up, help strengthen people, help strengthen their resolve to overcome the challenges. Now, let me just say, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 came about sometime in April or May. No, came about in August of 1965. But the Mississippi legislature met in January 1966 and redistricted the whole state of Mississippi. In other words, they did it in such a way that no matter what the elected office was, that people would not have an opportunity to elect. They could vote, but they wouldn't have an opportunity to elect the person of their choice. Now, that took 13 years and 9 trips to the United States Supreme Court to undo. And Dr. Phillips was instrumental working with Senator Kirksey and Carol Rhodes and others in undoing that system that was set in place and equipping people with the information that people need to make the best possible decisions. Information helps that. So any kind of way that you can share information, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's in the press, and especially the Black press, which is far less censored than say the major state papers.
So, as I was a senior, I wrote to several graduate schools, and I got a scholarship to the University of Illinois. And I was going to go there and expand my knowledge in the social sciences. But as I got more correspondence from the University of Illinois, what I realized was the scholarship that they had offered me was really just a drop in the bucket compared to what I was going to need financially. So, and it was too late for me to even find a job anywhere else. And so I ended up really a whole year at home getting re-educated on my own, because most of my books I had kept them. So I did a lot more reading and training myself while I was at home that 1 year. And during that year, I also wrote to every school district in the state of Mississippi to try to get a job teaching. Only one of them, two of them responded. A guy from Leland, which is in Washington County, came over and interviewed me and promised me a job as a social studies teacher and said I would also be directing the student newspaper. So I spent a good part of that summer also reading up on what it takes to be a journalist or a newspaper advisor since I was going to this job. The other response that I got was from a Catholic high school in Clarksdale. The man from Leland came to Rosedale and interviewed me on my front porch. The people from Clarksdale invited me up, so I came on the Continental bus for that interview. It turned out that summer that as school was about to start, I didn't hear from the man, Mr. Levison in Leland, so I called him. And he said, well, I'm sorry to tell you, Mr. Phillips, but I found a lady right here in Leland who is going to teach the social studies. And meanwhile, the people up in Clarksdale, because I had been talking about graduate school, assumed that I was going to be going off to grad school. So when I called them back, they said, oh, well, yeah, we thought you were going off to school in California. But they had held the job open, and so the next year, in September, I was able to get a job teaching in Clarksdale. I taught the social science. I taught American history, world history, Mississippi history, Negro history, civics, sociology, geography, and economics. Over a 4-year time, I taught all 8 of those subjects because I was the only social studies teacher. So each year I would teach 4 different, subject areas. But my mind was always on going back to graduate school because I figured I still don't know enough. I decided to do my dissertation in Black history. So one of the guys who was on my committee decided he couldn't deal with this, and so he eventually left the University of Washington altogether. The other guy, who was my chairperson, white guy, he decided he didn't want to be the chairperson and have his name on that kind of dissertation. So he stepped down from being the chairperson. Fortunately, there was a black person in the College of Ed, and I chose him to be my chairperson and made it through the dissertation and then passed. Because I guess once I passed the written exam, I didn't have any problem because most of the folks on the committee had no knowledge of Black history at all. So they couldn't really, pose any real deep questions regarding the dissertation, except the black guy who was the chairperson. And he incidentally had grown up in Arkansas. After I left the University of Washington, I already had a job waiting for me because when I went there, I went on a fellowship that the program had been started by Dr. John Peoples. And the way the program operated, he was trying to increase the number of black PhDs at Jackson State. And this program allowed faculty members to come to the University of Washington, and they were paid whatever their salaries were at Jackson State. And so I went on that program, and that meant that once I finished, I was obligated to come back to Jackson State and teach for a number of years. I came back as chairman of the Department of Social Sciences. I came back as chairman in the fall of '71, and I remained chairperson until the summer of '83. Ooh, and there are a number of those students. And I'll start with one who was kind of unsung. There's a young man now who works for the Post Office Department in Jackson State. In Jackson. He's one of the most brilliant students I had. His name is Lindsay, D.W. Lindsay. His granddad was a treasurer of the local NAACP. When he came to Jackson State, he was a brilliant student, one of the smartest students I've ever taught. He aced my classes that he took. And after graduating, he went to the University of Mississippi Law School. He finished the law program in flying colors, but he never passed the bar exam. As a matter of fact, in his class, none of the black students passed the bar exam. And they really staged a real, protest kind of controversy. Some kind of way, most of them got back into the program and were able to pass. And one of them, the young lady, went to Louisiana, and she passed through that. But Lindsay never did pass, and he didn't want to go out of state because he had an aging grandmother that he was taking care of. So from that point on, he got a job with the Postal Service, and he's been with them ever since. But an absolutely brilliant young man. When I stepped down as Dean of School of Ed at Jackson State, I recommended one of my former students, Dr. Daniel Watkins, and he became the dean. He also was a very outstanding student of mine. In the state senate now, Derek Simmons was one of my students. He and his brother were students of mine when they were sophomores. Derek went on to become a senator, and his brother went on to become the mayor of Greenville. I wish I had just made a list, but there are a number of outstanding students that I've had. Lisa Ross took my class at one point in her sojourn at Jackson State. I learned that teachers, number one, ought never be, ashamed if they don't have all of the answers. So I could always tell the kids, okay, well, this is what I know now, but tomorrow I'll be able to give you a little bit more. Secondly, as a teacher, I learned that students probably more than anything else want the teacher to feel as if they are people who really matter.
Dr. Phillips, and I hope you can use this, Dr. Phillips was the type of professor that I've spent 26 years trying to be and have been unable to accomplish. Because Dr. Phillips was able to set high academic standards, to not bend or reduce those high academic standards, but be nurturing simultaneously. And let me be clear about that. There are some professors who have great high academic standards, but they don't know how to be nurturing. They don't know how to be comforting and to guide a young person along, right? And then there are some professors who can be nurturing, and it's good that they're nurturing, but they tend not to have the highest academic standards. And so Dr. Phillips, his style of teaching was that we were reaching for the highest mark of ourselves, and that he was going to push us to do things that we didn't think we were capable of doing, but he could do it with such love and such a nurturing spirit that, to be quite honest, I failed at being able to do both. I can do the high academic standard, but I don't know if I've ever accomplished being the type of nurturing being that Dr. Phillips was. So it was going to Dr. Phillips' class was like going to have your world expanded every day. In fact, he was such a great professor that you went to his office because I took his class on Tuesday and Thursday, so it was a hour and 20-minute class. That was not enough time. Like it was one of the few times that when class would end, I would be sad. It was one of the few times that to leave his class and to go somewhere else was going to be less than what you were getting from him. So I spent a great amount of time in his office because I couldn't get enough of the Tuesday, Thursday hour and 20 minutes because he was so engaging and so inspiring that he made me real. He affirmed what my parents told me. So my parents taught me that I could be anything. And here was a man in the highest academic setting showing us that through diligence and research and reading and engagement, we could become the best of ourselves. Wisdom warrior for Dr. Ivory Phillips. A steady ship undeterred by racist waves and wrong way winds, a mighty magnolia standing strong against the soaring snows of chauvinism and ocean of intellect, pouring himself into the rivers of his students, engineering liberation one mind at a time, a scholarly knight slicing through chalky lies about African brain power, helping to slay the dragon of heirs while sifting through the excrement of IHL to create a fertilizer for future flowers rising to the sun in the sparkling name of self-determination. A liberation professor unshackling the minds of minstrels, a radical Rosedale renegade wrestling with history to restore the secrets of the pyramids, standing at the intersection of Achilles and Odysseus, armed with the silver bullets of knowledge and the stainless steel shield of self-love, a blues man with a funk attitude, weaving jazz as a juju anecdote for those whose souls have been swallowed by the gangrene greed of white fallacy, a blue bingle bowing to nobody because black is the base from which the world sprouted, and he continues to tell it on the mountain because truth is a fire that cannot be extinguished.